police officer is standing inside a small house on Lindley Street in Bridgeport, Connecticut, late at night, responding to a call that didn't fully make sense when it came in. Someone inside the house had reported objects moving on their own. There were no signs of forced entry and no indication that anyone else was there. When he steps into the living room, nothing immediately stands out. The furniture is in place. Everything looks undisturbed. For a moment, it feels like the kind of call that might resolve itself just by being there. But as he's standing in the room trying to make sense of what he's been told, a chair shifts. It lifts slightly off the floor and drops back down hard enough that the sound carries through the space and stops him where he is. There's no one near it. He takes a few steps forward, looking around more carefully now. He checks the doorway, then the corners of the room, trying to find anything that explains what he just saw. Nothing does. And then, as he turns slightly to get a better look behind him, something else moves. By the time he reacts, the room is still again. When additional officers arrive, he explains what happened inside the house, and before long, they begin reporting things of their own. And at that point, whatever was happening on Lindley Street was no longer something one person could explain away. What you just heard describes events reported inside a house on Lindley Street in Bridgeport, Connecticut in 1974, most often identified as 966 Lindley Street, although records of the case are not entirely consistent. The home belonged to a family who had started noticing small disturbances. At first, it was easy to overlook. Items would be out of place, just enough to be noticed, but not enough to explain. Over time, that changed. The movement of objects became more noticeable, and in several instances, witnesses reported objects moving in front of them. What had started as something subtle became harder to dismiss. As the activity continued, it began drawing attention beyond the family. Neighbors became aware of what was happening inside the house, and eventually calls were made to the police. Officers responded more than once. And what started inside a single home began to spread, with multiple people reporting events they couldn't easily account for. But as the story spread, so did questions about what was actually happening inside the house. Because while members of the family and some of the officers believed they had witnessed something they couldn't explain, others who reviewed the case later weren't so sure. I'm your host, Robert Barber. In 1974, a family living on Lindley Street in Bridgeport, Connecticut, began reporting disturbances inside their home that became increasingly difficult to explain. As the activity escalated, police were called to the house, and what started as a situation inside a single home quickly expanded to multiple witnesses. But as the story spread, so did disagreement over what was actually happening. This is the story of the Lindley Street Poltergeist. Let's get into it. In 1974, a family was living in a house on Lindley Street in Bridgeport, Connecticut. It was a normal house, and for the most part, life inside it followed a routine. The parents went about their day, and their daughter, around 11 years old, was usually inside, staying close by. At first, nothing about it stood out, but then small things started happening. Things that were easy to notice, but just as easy to dismiss. A cup that had been set down earlier wasn't where it was supposed to be. Something small would turn up somewhere else. The kind of thing you might question for a second and then move on from. But it kept happening, and it didn't take long before it stopped feeling random. Because things weren't just ending up in different places anymore, they were moving while people were there. A container would shift across a surface without anyone touching it, or something small would move, stop, and then move again, all while someone was in the room watching it happen. And that's when it changed. This wasn't something discovered after the fact. People weren't walking in and noticing something had already happened. They were there, seeing it as it happened, trying to make sense of it in real time. It didn't stay in one place either. It would happen in the kitchen, then later in another room, sometimes when someone walked in, and other times when they had just looked away for a moment and turned back to find something had changed. As it continued, people started paying closer attention, waiting for it to happen again, and when they did, it often did too. At that point, it wasn't something you could explain away as being misplaced or overlooked. Something was happening inside that house, and people were there to see it when it did. As the activity inside the house continued, it didn't stay limited to the family for long. Neighbors started hearing about it and came over to see what was happening for themselves. And in some of those early visits, they didn't have to wait. They would walk into a room, stand there for a moment, and something would move. An object sitting on a surface would shift without anyone touching it, sometimes while several people were looking directly at it, close enough to see that no one had caused it. Word spread quickly after that. More people started coming to the house, not just to hear about it, but to see it. At times, there were several people inside at once, standing in the same rooms where activity had already been reported, watching and waiting for it to happen again. And in many of those moments, it did. Objects would move while people were already focused on them, sometimes shifting once, then again while the same group remained in place, watching it happen. As that continued, the way people watched began to change. At first, they stood back, but once they saw something move, they started stepping closer, focusing on specific areas, watching the exact spots where it had already happened, trying to catch it in the act. Some would stay in the same position for several minutes, watching a single surface, waiting, and when it happened again, it happened while they were already looking at it. The activity didn't stop because people were there. If anything, it continued in front of them. And as more people came through the house and saw it for themselves, what had started as something happening to one family began to draw wider attention. Eventually, the police were called. Officers arrived expecting to find a clear explanation once they were inside. They moved through the house methodically, checking the position of objects, looking for anything that might explain what had been reported. But while they were there, something moved. Objects shifted position in the room while officers were present, with no one close enough to have caused it. More than one officer saw it happen. And at that point, what had been described by the family and by the people who had come to see it was now taking place in front of them. What had started inside a single home was no longer limited to the people who lived there. It was now something that others witnessed for themselves. And it didn't stay contained to the inside of the house. As word continued to spread, people began gathering outside. Neighbors, onlookers, others who heard what was happening and wanted to see it up close. Some stood along the street. Others tried to get closer to the house. At times, the number of people outside grew large enough that police weren't just responding to the house, they were managing the scene around it. For a period of time, what was happening inside that home wasn't just being experienced, It was being watched. As more people continued coming through the house and officers remained involved, the activity didn't just continue, it became harder to follow. People started focusing on specific spots, watching the exact places where something had already moved, waiting for it to happen again. And while they were looking right at it, it would. An object would shift without anyone touching it, sometimes moving once, settling, and then moving again while the same group stood there watching. At times, no one moved at all. Several people stood close enough to see clearly, holding their positions, and even then, something would change right in front of them. But it didn't stay in one place. Someone might be watching one surface, focused on it, waiting. And then, something else in the room would move instead, pulling everyone's attention in a different direction. And as soon as they turned to that, something else would happen again. There were moments where more than one thing was happening within the same span of time. Something would move in one part of the room, then somewhere else, sometimes before anyone had fully processed what they had just seen. People started adjusting where they stood, moving closer, changing angles, trying to narrow down where something could happen without being seen. But it didn't matter. Even when they were focused on one spot, it would happen somewhere else. And as it continued, the time between events started to shrink. Something would move, and before anyone had fully reacted, something else would follow. Then another. Not spaced out, but happening back to back. And with multiple people in the room, standing close, watching carefully, and waiting for it to happen again. It still did, right in front of them, with no one close enough to have caused it. By that point, it wasn't just something happening inside the house. It was happening in front of groups of people, and no one in the room could explain what they were seeing. As more people continued to observe what was happening inside the house, something else began to change. Not everyone in the room was seeing the same thing. Two people could be standing side by side, watching the same area, and one would see something move while the other didn't see it happen at all. Other times, something had already changed position, but no one could agree on when it happened. Someone might focus on a single object, watching it closely, not looking away, and nothing would happen. But the moment their attention shifted, something in the room had already moved. As more people filled the space, attention started to split. Some were watching one area, others were focused somewhere else. So when something moved, not everyone saw the same event, and not everyone described it the same way. People started comparing what they had just seen, and even standing in the same room, they weren't describing the same thing. And that's when attention started to shift toward the daughter. People weren't just watching the room anymore. They were watching her. She had been there during much of it, sometimes in the same room, sometimes just nearby. And now people were trying to understand whether that mattered. Their attention moved back and forth between her and the places where the movement had already happened, trying to see if there was any connection. But even then, the activity didn't stop. Objects still shifted position, sometimes in front of people watching closely, and other times in the moments when attention had already moved somewhere else. There were moments when something had already moved before anyone realized it. At that point, it wasn't just the activity that was difficult to explain. It was what people thought they were seeing. And the question had started to change. It wasn't just what was happening inside the house, but whether everyone was seeing the same thing when it did. As the activity continued, the focus inside the house started to shift. It wasn't just about watching it happen anymore. People started trying to make sense of it. With more people coming through the house, and with officers already involved, attention turned toward figuring out what could actually explain what they were seeing. They started looking for a pattern, where things had been, where they ended up, how it could happen without anyone being seen. But the more they looked for a pattern, the less clear it became. Nothing lined up. What happened in one moment didn't repeat the same way the next. And it didn't stop just because people were watching more closely. And even with people in the room watching closely, it still kept happening. Sometimes right in front of them. Other times, it happened in the moments when attention had moved somewhere else. And despite the number of people inside the house, watching, checking, comparing, no one was able to identify a clear source for what was happening. At the same time, people continued coming through the house. Some stayed longer, trying to make sense of it. Others left after seeing enough. But no one left with an answer. And by that point, it wasn't just something people were witnessing anymore. It was happening in front of them, and still, no one could explain it. What stands out about the events on Lindley Street isn't just what was reported, but how much those reports differ depending on the source. There are accounts describing multiple witnesses, including police officers observing objects move without contact while inside the house. There are also specific accounts that describe larger objects moving inside the house too. In some versions of the case, witnesses, including police officers, reported seeing a refrigerator shift position without anyone touching it. Like many details in this case, that claim isn't consistently documented across all sources, but it appears often enough in retellings that it becomes part of how the event is remembered. And if that detail is accurate, it raises a different level of question, because it suggests movement that would be difficult to explain through small-scale manipulation alone. Some of those descriptions state that officers were present when movement occurred, and that what they saw matched what had already been described by the family and others who had entered the home. At the same time, the documentation surrounding those observations is limited. There are no widely available official reports that provide detailed, consistent descriptions of what officers witnessed inside the house, and much of what is known comes from secondhand interviews and retellings recorded after events had already taken place. Because of that, it becomes difficult to confirm exactly what those witnesses saw in the moment. Another factor that complicates how this case is understood is how quickly the story spread beyond the house itself. As more people became aware of what was being reported, the number of secondhand descriptions increased, with details being repeated, retold, and in some cases slightly altered depending on the source. That kind of spread makes it difficult to separate what was directly observed from what was heard after the fact. Some of the descriptions that exist today come from individuals who were not present during the initial events, but who later reported what they had been told or what they believed had taken place inside the house. Even among those who were present, there's no single continuous record that captures the sequence of events from beginning to end. What exists instead are individual accounts, often describing specific moments rather than a complete timeline. So the overall picture is built from separate pieces, not from a single, consistent observation. And that's where this case starts to shift from what was reported to what can actually be supported. And when those pieces are placed side by side, they don't always line up in a way that creates a clear sequence of what happened inside the house. The same pattern shows up across many of the descriptions. Some describe clear movement happening in full view, while others describe moments where something had already changed position before anyone realized it. Even within those accounts, there are moments that would be difficult to recreate without being seen. That difference matches what was happening inside the house itself, where people in the same room weren't always seeing the same thing at the same time. There's also the question of the daughter's role in the events. Multiple descriptions note that the activity often occurred while she was nearby, and that some observers began watching her as closely as they watched the room itself. And that detail connects to a broader pattern that has been noted in other cases. In a number of reported poltergeist cases, the activity is said to center around a specific person, often a child or teenager. That shows up often enough that it's been discussed by investigators over time. But even there, the explanation isn't clear. Some have suggested it could be connected to stress, or something psychological that manifests physically. Others see it as part of the phenomenon itself, something external rather than something coming from the person. In this case, the daughter becomes a point of focus, not because there's a clear explanation tied to her, but because, like in other cases, the activity is often reported while she's nearby. And as with the rest of this case, that detail raises a question without fully answering it. There are also later accounts that complicate this further. In some versions of the case, it's been reported that the daughter admitted to staging at least some of the activity. On its own, that would seem to explain what people thought they were seeing. But it doesn't fully line up with everything that was reported. Because there are also accounts from multiple witnesses, including police officers, who said they saw objects move while they were in the room with no one close enough to have caused it. So even if some of the activity was staged, that doesn't clearly explain all of it. And that's where this case becomes harder to pin down. But here again, the available information is incomplete. There are no clear documented observations that establish a direct connection between her actions and every reported event, and no single source provides a fully consistent sequence of what happened during each instance of movement. What remains is a set of overlapping descriptions. Some describe events that, taken at face value, would be difficult to explain through ordinary means. Others describe moments where not everyone present saw the same thing at the same time, and where the sequence of what happened is less clear. There are reports involving multiple witnesses, including officers, who were present when movement was said to occur. At the same time, there is no single consistent record that captures those events in detail as they happened. And there are moments where attention shifts towards the daughter without a clear account that explains how every instance of movement took place. All of those elements exist at the same time, and none of them fully resolve the others. This is the point where I step out of the story a little bit, because if you've listened to enough of these cases, you start to notice something. A lot of them sound really similar. Different locations, different people, different years, but the patterns repeat. Objects moving, people witnessing it, conflicting accounts, someone at the center of it. And at some point, you have to decide what to do with that. Because either all of these people are describing something that isn't actually happening, or there's something to these reports that we still don't fully understand. And I'll be honest, this is where I run into some friction myself. I've spent enough time with these cases, and enough time looking at what people claim to have experienced that it's hard for me to dismiss all of it outright. Especially because I've had my own experiences that I can't fully explain. If you've listened to this show for a while, you might remember the Madison Seminary episode. It's called The Haunting of Madison Seminary, The Investigation That Spoke Back. It's episode 27. I'll put a link in the show notes. That wasn't a secondhand account. That was me, in that building, hearing things, experiencing things, and even capturing audio that I still can't fully explain. That audio will be linked in the episode as well. And that doesn't mean I jumped to a conclusion about what it was. It just means that I can't explain it. And when you start putting that next to cases like this one, you start to run into a bigger question. Because if even a small part of what people are describing in these cases is real, then it doesn't just raise questions about what's happening in a house like this. It raises questions about what happens after we're gone. And I don't have an answer for that. But it starts to feel harder to dismiss the question entirely. There are enough reports, enough experiences, enough things that don't quite fit, that it becomes difficult to ignore it completely. And at the same time, none of it lines up clean enough to explain it. This has been State of the Unknown. The events on Lindley Street became one of the most widely discussed poltergeist cases in the United States at the time, drawing in neighbors, investigators, and even police officers who, according to multiple accounts, witnessed objects moving inside the house. There's no single consistent record of what happened inside that house as it happened. What remains is a collection of overlapping accounts, some that support each other and others that don't fully align. And whatever was taking place inside that house, no one ever gave an explanation that resolved all of it. If you like these stories because they're told straight, with no fluff and no hype, you're exactly who this show is for. And if that's you, leaving a quick rating or review really does help more people find the show. On Spotify, it's just a tap of the stars. And if you're listening on an iPhone, you can leave a short written review on Apple Podcasts. I read every one. And if you want to make sure you hear the next story when it drops, just hit follow in your podcast app so the next episode shows up automatically. Until next time, stay curious. And remember, sometimes the story isn't what happened. It's whether everyone saw the same thing when it did.